Motivation is not the engine. It is the exhaust. It comes after the movement begins, not before. Most of us have it exactly backwards. We wait to feel ready, and that waiting quietly becomes the habit itself. The 2-minute rule is not a productivity trick. It is a theory about how the brain actually decides to begin. And once you understand the mechanism, the idea of waiting for inspiration starts to look like a very strange way to live. There is a version of yourself you have been waiting to become. The one who wakes up early and starts without resistance. The one who sits down to write or exercise or study without needing to negotiate with themselves first. You have probably assumed that person is powered by something you do not yet have, some stable reservoir of motivation that simply runs lower in you than in others. But the research tells a different story. Motivation is not a prerequisite for action. It is a consequence of it. Psychologists call this the action-mood relationship, the idea that doing something, even a very small version of it, creates a feedback loop that makes continuing easier. The feeling of readiness does not precede the work. It tends to arrive inside it. This is not a minor reframe. It changes the entire diagnosis of why you stop before you start. Every time you waited until you felt ready, you were waiting for something that only movement can produce. The trigger you were looking for was always on the other side of the beginning. What you gain from understanding this is not a shortcut. It is a correction, a way of seeing why every attempt that started with waiting was structurally unlikely to succeed. The problem was not your character. It was the sequence. Picture someone who has not opened their journal in 3 weeks. They keep meaning to. They want to. But every evening, the motivation is not quite there, so they wait for a better moment. The better moment does not come. This is not a discipline failure. It is a misunderstanding about how initiation works. Behavioral psychologist B.J. Fogg, in his 2019 book, Tiny Habits, showed that behavior change is almost never a function of motivation intensity. It is a function of simplicity and a reliable trigger. When the entry cost of a behavior drops low enough, motivation becomes largely irrelevant to whether it begins. His research across thousands of participants found that the people who succeeded at long-term habit change were not the most motivated. They were the ones who had made starting nearly frictionless. The 2-minute rule, popularized by James Clear in Atomic Habits in 2018, operationalizes this finding directly. Any habit, Clear argues, can be scaled down to a version that takes 2 minutes or less. The goal is not to complete the task in 2 minutes. The goal is to make showing up the default and completion a welcome bonus. What surprises me most about this is how counterintuitive it feels at first. We are culturally trained to associate effort with seriousness. Starting small reads emotionally as giving up. But neurologically, the act of beginning activates what researchers sometimes call a completion drive, a cognitive momentum that makes stopping harder than continuing. The resistance lives at the threshold. Once you are past it, the brain's relationship to the task shifts entirely. The deeper reason waiting feels rational is rooted in how the brain processes anticipated effort. Kahneman, in Thinking Fast and Slow in 2011, described the mind's strong preference for low-effort paths, what he called the law of least effort. The brain's planning system does not evaluate tasks by their actual difficulty. It evaluates them by the effort it imagines they will require. And imagination almost always overestimates. A task that takes 12 minutes feels, in the abstract, like it demands an hour of energy. This matters because the moment you reduce the imagined cost of beginning by committing only to 2 minutes, you change what the brain is actually evaluating. It is no longer assessing whether you can finish the report. It is assessing whether you can open the document. Those feel completely different to the nervous system. One produces avoidance. The other often produces movement. This connects to something William James, the 19th century philosopher and psychologist, observed long before neuroscience existed to support it. James argued that action is not downstream of will. It often constitutes the will itself. You do not decide to write and then write. You write, and somewhere in the first minute, you discover you are someone who is writing. The identity follows the act, not the other way around. There is something almost counterintuitive in this. We tend to believe that our sense of self determines our behavior. James suggested the mechanism can run in reverse. Behave first, and the self catches up. The 2-minute version of a task has to be genuinely tiny. Not ambitious tiny, but almost absurdly small. One sentence, not one paragraph. 1 minute of stretching, not a full warm-up routine. The instinct is always to scale it back up before giving it a chance to work. Fogg's research in tiny habits documented participants who tried to shrink their habits but still kept them large enough to require motivation. The reduction needs to remove the decision entirely. When the question becomes not, do I have the energy for this today, but simply, will I do the 2-minute version? The avoidance mechanism loses most of its grip. A practical entry point is what Clear calls habit stacking, attaching the tiny version to something already automatic. After you pour your morning coffee, you open the document. After you sit down in the evening, you pick up the book. The existing behavior becomes the trigger. The new behavior becomes the passenger. Over time, something more interesting happens. The 2-minute version is not the habit you keep. It is the gateway through which the real habit eventually walks. Most days, you will continue well past the 2 minutes, not because you forced yourself, but because the completion drive takes over once you have begun. What this actually means is that the problem was never motivation. It was architecture. You were trying to build something by wanting it into existence. The 2-minute rule gives you a single small action to take every day. And the quiet truth about systems is that a small action repeated daily becomes a pattern before you remember deciding to build one. If this way of thinking about how the mind actually works interests you, this channel exists to go deeper into exactly that, building a more accurate map of your own behavior rather than the version you assumed was fixed.